Hello, my name is Allison Hauserman. I was born in 1951, and in 1960 I was 9 years old. I knew people who served and I knew people who died in Vietnam. Yes, especially towards when I was like in 17, 18, 19 years old, right at the end of the 60s. I knew people from my high school and friends of my family. And then I knew people who served in the war when I was in college who were returning veterans. I do have contact with people who were veterans in Vietnam, but not those particular people. Martin Luther King was assassinated. I was devastated. I felt like our country was just falling apart. I mean, really falling apart. I mean, we had had several other assassinations during the 60s, and I think I was somewhat shell shocked. I felt like, how could this be happening here? And I really admired Dr. King, so it was really very difficult for me when he was assassinated. There was Malcolm X, there was Medgar Evers, there was John F. Kennedy, there was Robert F. Kennedy, there was the three civil rights workers in Mississippi. There was Viola Liuzzo, who was killed on her way home from taking some marchers home from the Selma March. And she was a white woman who was killed by some Klans people. So there were a lot of them. Probably the one that got me the most, though, was Dr. King. I was really young when President Kennedy was assassinated. I mean, I was in middle school, and I remember it really vividly. I was sitting in science class, and I remember what I had on. I had on a green sweater and skirt, and all of a sudden the radio came alive over the PA system, and the first thing we heard was President Kennedy has been shot. We repeat, President Kennedy has been shot in Dallas. And of course, he died shortly thereafter. He was probably already dead, but we didn't know that. It was absolutely amazing to me because I knew that people got assassinated in other countries, but I didn't think that happened in our country. And I remember being glued to the TV through his whole the, and then, right after that, the man who shot him was assassinated too. So I remember just being glued to the TV through the whole, right up through the whole funeral, and I just couldn't stop watching it. It was just so horrifying to me. Not in the 60s. Not I didn't get involved in it till the 70s. Sort of the late 60s, early 70s. I started college in 1969. And at that point, I got involved in all kinds of movements: the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti war movement, all of that stuff. So it was at the very end of the 60s when I started college that I really got involved in movements. Up until then, I supported the goals of the civil rights movement, but I wasn't really involved in a movement. I lived in a very suburban area where people just didn't really talk about that stuff too much. So I didn't really know how to get involved in a movement till I went away to college. I lived in Atlanta, Georgia in 1960 and 61, and we, I mean, it was still segregation then with separate bathrooms and all of that. So I hated it, and I somewhat refused to go along with it. I did try sometimes to go into the bathrooms that were labeled colored, or drink from the fountains that were labeled colored. And I was only 9 years old, but I was very determined that this was wrong. And I challenged my parents about it a lot because they had always told me everyone was equal. But they said, "You're going to get killed. You'll get us all killed if you keep doing this. So you need to stop." Um, and I was pretty much an outcast while we lived down there because I insisted on telling everyone that segregation was wrong and Civil War was a good thing the North won, which was a terrible thing to say to Southerners in 1960. So I definitely objected to segregation and to the way African Americans were treated, but I didn't always know what to do about it. Like everyone else, I listened to the Beatles. The Beatles were very big. I loved Simon and Garfunkel. I liked the Rolling Stones, the Doors, Jimi Hendrix, all kinds of rock music. That's pretty much all I listened to. And a little bit of folk. I did Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and some of those people too. I was not a genuine hippie in some ways because I was too polite and in the sense that I thought that the some of the conventions that I had learned about being polite to people and being nice and everything, that those were all still good. So I didn't ever run around acting wild, but I did dress like a hippie. I had bleach blonde hair down to my waist, and I wore granny glasses. And Janis Joplin was my hero, so I dressed a lot like Janis Joplin. Lots of flowing skirts and jeans, and I wore a lot of high heeled boots and I don't know, all kinds of stuff like that. But I kind of had the hippie look down. I was not into drugs at all, not at all. Um, like many college students, I did drink, but I didn't really, I didn't think drugs were a great idea. I had friends who regularly smoked weed, um, took LSD, took mescaline, did speed, and I didn't do any of it. I just thought it was too dangerous. I thought these things are illegal and you don't know what you're getting when you get it, so who knows what the heck you're getting. And I I just didn't like the idea. I never liked the idea of being out of control. And I knew that you had no control over how you were going to act if you took illegal drugs. So I didn't do that. Um, I was around people who did, but I didn't. Probably the Cuban Missile Crisis in early 60s when we President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev of Russia kind of got into a who's going to back down first thing. And I can remember that all through up until that point, I was never terribly afraid that even though we had air raid drills and bomb drills and everything about nuclear bombs, I was never terribly afraid until then. But once we had the Cuban Missile Crisis and pretty much everybody thought that we were going to have a nuclear war with Russia, I was really scared. And I spent a lot of years after that being very fearful of when the war was going to start. It was kind of scary. So that was probably the thing I remember. Probably my most memorable moment was when I asked my mother, "Is there any chance we're going to get in a war with Russia?" And she said, "Yeah, I think so. I think it could happen." And I thought, "Oh my God, the whole world's going to end." I'm just a little kid. This can't happen. I'm not ready. So, um, so that would be it, I think.